Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. In the spirit of the trees, in the spirit of living nature, of which we are an integral part, with deep gratitude to all of our ancestors who have brought us to the present moment in the human journey, I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we begin the second of 5 sessions on the Pachamama Alliance and everything that this extraordinary group is doing to both protect the Amazon and to bring into global awareness a new dream in which the indigenous wisdom and the science of the modern mind can conjoin in a way that it is abundant and is healing for the planet and is in alignment with natural systems. That is the greatest challenge of our time, because as all of us know, we humans, particularly in the industrial North, have so mismanaged the global ecology over the last several centuries that we've radically destabilized the climate. Extreme weather is now a regular occurrence everywhere around the world. And we're in what the Secretary General last year called Code Red. And we are now in the situation that scientists have been warning us about for the last 75 years, since they first, back in the 1960s, forward, began to warn our governments and the global community about climate change and the fact that we needed to stop our CO2 emissions and we needed to get back into alignment with the environment. We did not. We are still ravaging virtually every place on Earth in one way or another. And there's a valiant group of NGOs and progressives also that are global, that are struggling mightily to turn this thing around. And Pachamama Alliance is in the leadership of those groups, as I said, that have focused on the Amazonia, the lungs of the earth, and not only to protect that ecosystem, but to develop a heightened spiritual awareness where the eagle and the condor, the indigenous mind and the Western modern mind can conjoin as one. Before we launch into our program, we want to do what we always do on Humanity Rising, and that is to engage in just a few minutes of coherence breathing. We do this every day because chaos is escalating everywhere around the world. There's not a single country anywhere that is not experiencing increased duress, higher crime rates, anxiety rates, depression rates, suicide rates, particularly among the young, and all kinds of concerns at the reality that the world is spinning out of control. And therefore, what we do each day on Humanity Rising is we engage in a coherence breathing practice so that whatever's going on outside, whatever's in the news, whatever is emerging that is challenging us at all the levels, because we're now in multiple code reds, we can maintain our inner equilibrium. And so this breathing is very simple. For those of you who may not have attended any of our sessions before, we breathe in for 5.5 seconds, slowly, and we exhale for 5.5 seconds. Inhale. We're going to do it about 15 times. According to modern science, this kind of breathing is the optimal way to calm your entire system, to balance your parasympathetic and your sympathetic nervous systems, to bring coherence to your heart, and to bring coherence between your heart and your brain in a way that produces emotional and psychological equilibrium. We urge everyone to practice it every day. I'll put in the link, YouTube, and what you're going to hear is just simply the sound of bells. Be a bell at the beginning, you breathe in, then you'll hear another bell and breathe out. Do it as slowly as you can. If you have challenges and you can't go for 5.5 seconds, that's perfectly okay. The key is to breathe in a balanced way, slowly. And what you're going to see on the screen is a 5-pointed star that's created by the planet Venus and the Earth as they orbit the sun. It creates a 5-pointed star. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing. And the reason why the 5 is so powerful as a way of breathing is that's the number of Venus. That's because it creates a 5-pointed star as it goes around the sun. And that is the number of the goddess Aphrodite and Ishtar and Inanna. So when you're breathing in to this 5.5 second breath in and out, you're breathing with Pachamama. You're breathing in the mother. You're breathing out the mother. So as you do this breathing, think of Pachamama. And then we'll introduce the founders of the Pachamama Alliance, which is just dedicated to the Great Mother in a very powerful way. Thank you, everyone. Georg? Thank you, everyone. I was just imagining as we were all breathing together, what if the whole world would start to breathe together in a coherent way? I would be willing to bet all the money I have that if the world would begin to breathe together in the name of the mother, almost all of our global problems would solve themselves quite quickly, quite naturally, because we would be breathing as one. It's just worth remembering the trees behind me. As we breathe in, they breathe out. As we breathe out, they breathe in. As Plotinus said, the whole universe breathes together. So it's in that spirit I want to introduce my very good friend and longstanding colleague since way back in the 1990s when I met Bill Twist and his wonderful wife, Lynne, who co-founded with John Perkins and a number of others, the Pachamama Alliance, that really birthed a powerful impulse around holding sacred, not only the ecosystem, but the peoples of Amazonia, and bringing into the modern mind a new kind of dream. And one of the things that's been spawned by the Pachamama Alliance that we'll be talking about today is the whole notion of extending legal rights to nature. We are nature. Me speaking to you is nature speaking. You listening is nature listening. And what a state of affairs that we have to extend legal rights to our own mother. But such is the way of the world. And the pioneers of that very important, I would say, seminal impulse has been some of the people that you're going to hear today. So, Bill, welcome to Humanity Rising, and I turn the program over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. Good to see you. We were on yesterday as Pachamama Alliance talking about our beginnings, our origins with the work in the Amazon. And I'll just, for people who weren't here yesterday, one of the things, the messages that we got at the very beginning from working with indigenous people in the areas where we were in the Western Amazon basin in Ecuador and Peru, one of the messages we got at the very beginning was it was wonderful to be there working with them on the ground to figure out how to protect the rainforest and support them in ensuring the continuation of their culture, their lands. But they said if we really wanted to do the work that was going to be necessary to be done to protect the Amazon, we would need to go back up in our part of the world where the source of the destruction was coming from, and we would need to change the dream of the modern world. There was a big offer, a big instruction that we grappled with. And one of the first, so this initiative, engaging with rights of nature, was one of the things that emerged out of our looking at how do we end up changing the dream of the modern world? So in 2008, Pachamama Alliance and working with our foundation in Ecuador, Fundación Pachamama, had the opportunity to get involved with the country of Ecuador in writing its new constitution. And we were one of the advocates for proposing that rights of nature be included in that constitution. That ended up happening. And out of that process, an organization called the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature was created in 2010. And that organization is a network of organizations around the world working to promote the idea of legal rights for nature. So that organization is Pachamama Alliance is the fiscal sponsor for the Global Alliance for Rights of Nature. And we have with us today two of the key people who are on the executive committee and are driving forward that initiative, the Global Alliance for Rights of Nature. There's a really extensive executive committee of experts around the world, and we have two of the key ones with us today. So we're going to have a discussion today about rights of nature in general, about the work that the Global Alliance has been doing. And I want to introduce first, who we're going to hear from is Cormac Cullinan. And Cormac is an attorney from South Africa. Cormac has been involved in what originally he termed wild law. Way back in the early 2002, I think his book, Wild Law, was published, which was a really breakthrough idea, talking about this idea of law giving rights to the wild. And Cormac has worked as an attorney on environmental issues, green business issues since the early 2000s, and has worked throughout Africa, Europe, around the world, in 20 to 30 different countries. And Cormac actually was involved in one of the things he did was he was the principal person drafting the Universal Declaration for the Rights of Mother Earth that ended up being presented at the United Nations in 2012, I believe, 2010, 2012. So Cormac is with us today. He's a wealth of information. He's a wealth of stories about how this initiative, how this idea of rights of nature has evolved and appeared in the world. He's been one of the leading people guiding it. And so I want to introduce you to Cormac, and Cormac is going to talk about, he's going to talk about whatever he wants to talk about, because it'll all be interesting. But I've asked him to give some background about where this idea came from and how it got to where it is today. So Cormac, welcome. And I turn the space over to you.
Thank you very much, Bill, and it's a real pleasure to be here. So thank you for the invitation to both you and Jim. So I guess the story is for me is mixed up with my own life story. I mean, like many people, I realized as a child that human beings were devastating this incredible community of life that we were so fortunate to have been born into, and I thought, well, law is a powerful tool for regulating human behavior. If I become an environmental lawyer, then I can solve these problems, have better laws. So I did that. And, and I focused as much as I could on drafting legislation because I thought that would have the biggest impact. Then I started coming across problems which I couldn't solve with better drafting. And I began searching. When I was at law school, I'd come across this 1973 article by Professor Christopher Stone called "Should Trees Have Standing?" And I think probably if you study environmental law in most countries in the world, you'll read that article, and it was very interesting, and we all loved it. And it was this idea that it would be more practical if you could go to court in the name of, in that case, the Menorcan Valley or a river or something like that, because it was a better way of bringing the matter to court, rather than having to prove in a rather convoluted way that you had standing, because you're a member of an environmental organization, perhaps you visited the area, and very tenuous. But it didn't really go anywhere. We all loved it as an idea, but I think but there was a memorable phrase in that article. Christopher Stone talked about thinking the unthinkable. And I love that phrase, because basically what he's referring to is that we all have a kind of frame of reference, and ideas or thoughts which are outside of our frame of reference are, in a sense, unthinkable. And the first thing you have to do is think the unthinkable and pull those ideas within the frame of possible thought, as it were. And I think it's a good name for the early stages of the development of these ideas. I was very fortunate to then meet Thomas Berry, amazing American monk and scholar, one of the most amazing, I think the most amazing scholar I've ever come across. You could either sort of, spend 10 years studying something, or you could just ask Thomas and he'd tell you. Anyway, Thomas wrote a book called The Great Work, among others, in 1999, and he talked about the need for a new jurisprudence. And I think that what Thomas introduced was a kind of a depth to the ideas, which perhaps hadn't been fully developed with Stone. And what Thomas was saying really is that we are a part of this earth. We are so integrally connected with it that, in a sense, we are an aspect of Earth rather than something separate. And the universe is ordered. And if we want to flourish, we need to recognize that we need to play by the rules of this system of this ordered community of life. And he said that rights originate from existence, from the universe. In other words, just as we claim to have, just as we claim to have human rights, just because we exist by virtue of their existence, so everything that has come into being has the right to be and to play its part in the whole. And so, as he put it, the universe is the primary lawgiver. And that was a complete revelation to me, because when you study law, you get taught that all you need to know is in the law library. It's the legislation, it's the cases, and it's what the academics have said about them. And that meeting Thomas led me to write A Wild Law in 2002. So that's 20 years ago now. And in that, I followed on Thomas had outlined some 10 basic points for a new jurisprudence, and I sort of developed those ideas, what we called an earth jurisprudence. So at that stage, I think we were working very much in the realm of ideas. And then there was the next stage was, I suppose you could call it, the early adopters. So there were a series of wild law conferences were held in UK. The Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund in Pennsylvania at that time, Tom Lindsay and others started democracy schools. And in 2006, there was a Center for Earth Jurisprudence established in Florida. And 2007, Selda worked with the community at the Tamaqua Borough, which passed the first rights of nature legislation. But things really started happening from 2008, what you could call the Latin American Revolution. Because what happened then in 2008, Ecuador adopted a constitution with rights of nature in it. And that ended the debate about whether this was possible. It clearly was possible. It had now happened. That was followed, I'll leave Nati to talk more about that, but that was followed by a call in 2009 by the many South American countries in the Bolivarian Alliance. It's called ALBA. They said, we now need a universal declaration of rights. We've got the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but now we need a document which supplements it by recognizing that everything has got the right to exist. And then that led in 2010, after the failure of the Copenhagen climate change talks, to a People's World Conference on climate change and the rights of Mother Earth in Cochabamba in Bolivia, which is where I met Bill, and that resulted in the drafting of the adoption of the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth. But perhaps I should stop there and let Nati pick up the story from 2010.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Cormac. And we'll come back to you on what else is happening now. But that brings us up to actually where Natty showed up on the screen. So I want to introduce everybody to Natalia Green. Natalia is part of the Fundación Pachamama team in Ecuador. And Natty has a master's degree in social science. But the main thing is that she's one of the most effective person at making things happen that I've ever come across. And we met in 2008 when Ecuador was starting to work on this idea of adopting rights of nature in its constitution. And Natty took that project Thomas Lindsay had come down. Thomas was with the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund. Thomas Lindsay had come down and was working with the Constitutional Assembly. And Natty really organized that process to get the indigenous people on board, to get the other constitutional members of the Constitutional Assembly on board. Natty was just a whirlwind, and not just a whirlwind, but a really incisive, accurate advocate for the rights of nature. And really, I would say was probably the main, if we looked at, if there wasn't a key ingredient for having rights of nature get into Ecuador's constitution, it would be Natty Green. And so Natty was involved then when the Global Alliance for Rights of Nature was created in 2010. Cormac was involved in that. That happened at a conference in Ecuador. And the Global Alliance for Rights of Nature has taken on moving this idea forward around the world. And I would love to have Natty, you talk about how that process has gone and what's been accomplished and what is the status of the rights of nature movement now around the world as you see it. So welcome, Natty Green.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Jim. And thanks, Cormac, for preceding me in this very nice podcast. I'm very excited to be here with you all today. And it's true, actually, 14 years ago, the first person from whom I heard the idea of the concept of the rights of nature was from you, Bill. So we have a lot to thank you. I remember you telling me, like, there's this idea of the rights of nature. And I was like, this sounds a bit crazy, but it's so interesting. And yes, indeed, we were able to talk about this in the Constitution. I remember when we were just talking about it, we were expecting it only to be part of the debate. We weren't even hoping that this was going to be included because it was so radical, so amazing. But it was so beautiful to see that we had a constitutional process where all assembly members were dreaming of a different country. They had a first exercise where they were asked, what's the country you dream of? And one of those things was to really take in consideration and acknowledge and be responsible for the biodiversity of Ecuador, that is one of the most biodiverse places in the world. And therefore, we had 97 out of 114 assembly members that voted in favor of the rights of nature. And it was an amazing process where we had indigenous shamans and coming to the assembly, for example, doing a whole ceremony to bring the spirit of nature into the constitutional building, and a real powerful message given to the world, where Ecuador was becoming the first country in the world to recognize that nature is not an object that we exploit, is a subject that we respect. And that makes a huge difference. And that really promoted a very growing movement that, as we were talking earlier, when we met in 2010, we said it's an idea whose time has come, from Victor Hugo, but it wasn't at that point. We were just starting with an amazing idea. And now I feel that we have definitely reached that point where it's a really amazing and powerful idea that is captivating a lot of people from all over the world. And I just feel as if we are doing this sort of like acupuncture to the world, where these little places around the world are coming together and then are waking up in the idea that, of course, nature cannot be treated as an object, that nature needs to be recognized as a person, as a subject of rights, and that we need to go back to a more balanced relationship with nature. And that is happening around the world. We actually have 37 countries that now somehow recognize the rights of nature. Ecuador is still the only one that has it in its constitution. We were cheering for Chile, that unfortunately didn't become the second country in the world to do this, because it had rights of nature in its constitutional draft that unfortunately wasn't approved a couple of weeks ago. But we do have other countries like Bolivia, for example, that has national laws recognizing the rights of nature. Actually, when Bill introduced Cormac and he was mentioning the Universal Declaration for the Rights of Mother Earth, that is a document that we use as jurisprudence for our rights of nature tribunals that we can talk about later. That document is considered a national law in Bolivia, together with another law for the rights of Mother Earth. And we have very different experiences from, for example, in the United States, where you have more than 100 ordinances, local ordinances, that already recognize that nature is a subject of rights. and also a lot of experiences towards ecosystems. For example, the case of New Zealand with the Wanganui River, or the case of the Atrato River, or the case of in Brazil with Rio Doce, or the case in Bangladesh with all rivers that are recognized as rights-bearing entities. And this has allowed the communities to really get empowered with the idea that, of course, they need to mobilize and make their own governments or local governments or national governments recognize that nature is a subject of rights, and also promote its recognition and protection with this new standard, not just thinking, okay, we need to protect it like environmental law tells you to do. Environmental law is only telling you how much you can pollute the water, how much you can heat your slave, how much mercury you can put into the water. It's not telling you do not pollute the water. So this idea of the rights of nature is really a paradigm shifter. We're understanding that we need to have limits on how we deal with nature, because everything that we're doing to nature, we're doing it to ourselves. And we need to go back to that balance. And we will not achieve that balance if we are not able to recognize that nature has rights. And as I'm telling you, this movement has grown a lot. It's amazing to see how much it has grown, how many people are talking about the rights of nature around the world, how many countries are recognizing how it can. Maybe in the US, you won't be able to change your constitution, but you can change local ordinances. And maybe it's easier for places like Brazil or India or New Zealand to recognize the rights of an ecosystem, like a river, or in Colombia for the Amazon, or in France, for example, that is promoting an assembly, a Parlement de la Loi, for a river that has been polluted with toxic nuclear waste. Or in Spain, that Mar Menor has been recognized as the subject of rights. And this is happening all over the world. And it's so amazing, as I was saying before, because it's like this acupuncture to the world. We're just healing the world with these experiences that are happening all over. And it's very exciting to be part of this amazing movement. And I really thank these two beautiful people that I'm looking in the screen that are definitely great actors of, where we are right now.
Thank you, Natty. That was great. Could either of you or both of you talk a little bit about the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature, how it's organized, what its scope is, who's involved, and the kind of work it's doing? What is it doing? What is it taking on to keep spreading and anchoring this idea out in the world?
Maybe I'll say a few words and then leave the rest to Nachi. But one of the things what I remember is meeting Bill in Bolivia at the People's World Conference, and he said to me, I have this feeling that this rights of nature idea, could really be one of those ideas that could change the world. But he said, the question I have for you is, how do you scale it? How do you make it go? And I said, well, to be honest, I don't know the answer to that question, but what I would do is I would bring together everybody working on the idea in one room and ask them that question. And Bill kind of did that, and that was the meeting we had in Villa Manteles in Ecuador. And by probably about 10 o'clock on the first morning, we decided that if this idea was going to really make an impact on the world, it would need a vehicle. It would need to be carried forward by a movement. And what we decided is that we weren't going to form a sort of super organization like a big giant NGO. We were going to form an alliance. In other words, we weren't going to try and pull people out of the organizations that they're already working in, because typically people are already working where they're most passionate. We were going to create a way for all these organizations and all these communities to work together around a common purpose. And so it's a very important aspect of the alliance. And now we're creating regional hubs around the world to enable people in regions to work together more effectively, and probably it'll go right the way down to local areas. So I think it's very important to recognize that this is about bringing people together around the world around a common purpose, so that we can bring the kind of change which is very difficult to drive through normal political processes. I'll stop there.
Natty, do you want to add? Could you add to that?
Sure. Of course. Thank you, Cormac, for that introduction. And yes, indeed, when we created a GARN back in 2010, we definitely realized that we needed this organization, this alliance, because more than an organization, it's an alliance from all over the world to really take this idea and this message around the world. And it's been growing and growing. And actually in 2018, we decided to create these regional and thematic hubs. So now we have a North American, a European hub, a Latin American hub, and an African hub. And we also have a regional thematic hubs, like an Indigenous Council, a youth hub, an academic hub, and a legal hub that has allowed us really to expand and to reach very different audiences and very different in different languages with this idea of the rights of nature. Because what we're trying to do with GARN is GARN is the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature, is pretty much become a hub of information where you can find what are the rights of nature, find writings about it, find videos about it, find contacts on who can you reach if you want to have like an initiative of rights of nature in your own area and your local area. And it's an educational platform to really bring the message on. And it's been amazing to see how this movement has grown. We have more than 4,000 members now in all continents of the world. And it's grown beautifully. I'm including the chat, and hopefully our audience can also see that message in YouTube as well. But we have I've shared the GARN website, but also the tribunal website. And I wanted to share a little bit about that. That is, when we were in 2013, we realized that at some point, we were trying to convince people like nature should have rights. You have to recognize that nature is a subject, a rights-bearing entity. And at some point we said, no, we don't have to convince people that nature has rights, because it has rights. We just need to force our governments to say, like, why haven't you recognized rights of nature yet? Why haven't you done this yet? So the way to force this interaction with governments was pretty much to create a tribunal that is playing a subsidiary role of the government. Since the governments are not protecting nature and are not guaranteeing the rights of nature, we created a citizens tribunal, an ethical tribunal, to bring about cases from all over the world and listen to those cases and fail in favor of nature from a perspective of from the rights of nature. So you can see pretty much in those tribunals that there's a systematic problem around the world, that rights of nature are violated everywhere in the world, that this odd relationship with nature, a really violent relationship with nature, is happening all over the world. And when we have these tribunals, when we have these amazing judges, Cormac has been one of them. We just came back from Brazil with a delegation. When we have amazing people like Cormac being our judges, and Vandana Shiva and Leonardo Boff and so on, we have an assembly of more than 60 judges, and they see these crimes and they fail in favor of nature, then we bring attention to governments and to civil society that nature's rights are being violated and that we need a very urgent change. So we have organized 5 international rights of nature tribunals, 8 local tribunals, 2 regional tribunals, and this has been an amazing way to normalize the concept where people cannot and should not question if nature should have rights, but either question why aren't we recognizing the rights nature has.
So what, actually, and Natty, you referred to the website. The website has anyone who wants to learn about this topic and see the history of it or see the various legal arguments, how the tribunals work, all of that information is available on the website, the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature website.
Yes, Bill, the garn.org website, everything's available right there. And we want this community to keep growing and growing and sending the message out, because as we were saying, this is becoming bigger. And as we were talking earlier, this is nothing that we own, but we just have to accompany this process that is growing faster and faster. And we need an urgent change. The world is looking for this urgent change. We have the climate crisis on top of us. We understand what we have done to the earth, but unfortunately, I don't know why we cannot stop it radically and change the path. And the rights of nature perspective allows us to change the path. And it's really beautiful. And I can share a little bit about my experience here in Ecuador, where we have had rights of nature for the past 14 years. And it's amazing to be able to go to courts on behalf of nature. Next week, we have a hearing where we are trying to stop a large-scale copper mine from exploding in the really mega diverse cloud forest. And we are going on behalf of two frogs that were considered extinct and were rediscovered. And we're going to the court on behalf of those frogs. And it's amazing. We have more than 56 cases in Ecuador, most of them in favor of the rights of nature. And it's just so powerful to be able to go to courts on behalf of nature. And that's thanks to the recognition that we had 14 years ago.
Great, thank you. So what do you, Cormac, what do you see as the sort of what's on the horizon? What's the mountain we want to climb? What's the next real accomplishment with the rights of nature to move things forward?
Just before I answer, Bill, something that Nati said that sparked something with me is that, I think probably a lot of the people on the call would be conscious that many spiritual traditions say you don't need to try hard to be something. It's really about removing the obstacles that we've created on our true nature, the restrictions. And this work is a little bit like that. We know this incredible world lives, and we like the humans are like this little leaf at the top of the tree of life, or maybe not the top, it's on the extremities of it. And we're trying to say that we've got human rights, but the rest of the tree doesn't have the right to exist. So it's really about removing our delusions. And, quite evidently, we do live in an animate planet, and everything wants to fulfill its role. A tree wants to grow, etc. And it's just that in the 16th and 17th century in Europe, they came up with this idea that the world was a mechanism. And so then if the world was like a clock, it would make sense for humans to have rights and everything else to be objects. But of course, science has long abandoned that. They know that's not true, but the law and economics haven't. So the law is still structured on the basis that only humans and corporations and juristic persons like states have rights and everything else is object. And so part of what we're doing is trying to say, wake up and see the reality and then adjust our legal systems to recognize the reality of this planet. Don't work on some abstract notion. So I would say that what we're involved in here is part of a really exciting paradigmatic shift in paradigm or shift in dream, back to the realization that Indigenous people have always held, that we are absolutely integral part of Mother Earth, and that our primary role is to contribute to the health and functioning of the whole, like cells in the body, and that benefits us too. So it's not about striking a balance between what humans want and what nature wants. It's about pursuing human well-being through contributing to the health of the planet rather than the expense of it, at the expense of the planet. So one of the things that I love is that Buckminster Fuller quote, which I'm sure you all know about. He said, you never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing models obsolete. Now, this is not an entirely new model because we're really drawing on ancient wisdom here as well. But what we're trying to show through many different avenues is that it's far more realistic to acknowledge the reality that we are born members of this community of life. We need to understand how that community of life works and work out how we can contribute to it. And to give you to get to your question, Bill, there are lots of really exciting things popping up all over the place. One of them that's come up recently has been, we were approached by some people who are experts on Antarctica. Now, Antarctica and the ecosystem around Antarctica is enormous. I mean, it's something like 20% of the southern hemisphere, 10% of the global surface, and it's an absolutely crucial ecosystem. But the colonial process was never completed with Antarctica. So, countries went and planted their flags there and claimed slices of it, but they never quite managed to annex them. And then there was an Antarctic treaty system brought in, which froze the claims. And now it's in this slightly strange governance regime. But of course, Antarctica has been terribly affected by climate change. And then Antarctic Treaty System only deals with issues which happen within that area. And climate change is originating primarily from outside of that area. So people said, well, could you apply this idea to Antarctica? So we were in the early stages of working on a declaration which would recognize Antarctica as something like a sovereign state, but a self-regulating one. In other words, we're kidding ourselves if we think we can control Antarctica. It's a self-regulating ecosystem, and it should have a status rather like a state at the international level. And we think we should be able to stand up in a court elsewhere in the world and say, I represent Antarctica, and what you're doing is harmful to my client's interests. But part of what we're talking about is also a teaching opportunity. It's saying, when you look at Antarctica, don't look at it as a pie to be divided up, as a resource to be chopped up and into pieces like we've done with the rest of the world. Forget that colonial mindset. It will lead to conflict and strife. What we need to do is stand inside Antarctica and look outwards and say, what is in the best interest of this incredibly beautiful, wild continent and the ecosystem around it? What is in the best interests of the whales and the penguins and the krill? And as soon as you start thinking like that, it's a kind of disruptive way of thinking, which opens up all kinds of new possibilities. So I think there's some really interesting stuff that's happening at that level, also with the Amazon, seeing the Amazon as not just part of the possessions of each of the countries, but as a single organic being, which deserves recognition and respect by all of the nations, and whom all of us have an interest. So these are, I suppose, disruptive ideas, but I think very helpful ideas, because if one looks at what's happening in the world at the moment, there's such a terrible dearth of good ideas. I mean, people, we know that the so-called business as usual is leading us to destruction. We know we can't stay on the same path. But what we need to do is, like Buckminster Fuller said, we need to create credible alternatives that people can defect to. So one of the things that the International Rights of Nature Tribunal does is say, this is an example of how you could make decisions in a very different way, and you'd get better decisions. If we heard cases like this, which are oriented at achieving restorative justice, in other words, we're not trying to send people to prison because that doesn't help the river or the forest. We're trying to say, this is a violation of the rights of other beings, and what needs to be done to put that right and to restore the health of the planet, and hence restorative justice. So I think that everything changes, though, once one embraces the reality that we are creatures who are living in community with this amazing community of life with whom we co-evolve, and that we need the real purpose of rights of nature is first to get people to see that there's other subjects, in other words, that the world's animate. And secondly, to give rise to the corresponding duties on humans to respect those rights. So despite the name, it's actually more about what are the duties of humans to respect and live in, to coexist harmoniously with other beings. And it's an incredibly exciting time and movement to be involved in, because it's just based on timeless truths. And for me, it's about removing the blinkers of delusion and seeing the world more clearly. So yes, I could go on all night about it, but let me stop there.
Thank you, Cormac. Natty, do you have anything to add about what you see on the horizon, or new territory to take with this movement, this building movement?
So Bill, I see that the movement is growing very fast, and there are people very interested to bring the idea of the rights of nature. I was very surprised this past April 22nd, the day of Mother Earth, where I heard countries like at the United Nations talking about the rights of nature, countries like Kazakhstan, or countries that we haven't really heard like coming up Poland, with the idea of the rights of nature. And I just understand that this urgency is leading us and leading, even world leaders to talk about the rights of nature. We remember Macron said that the rights of nature is the only way to go about conservation of the planet. He hasn't really done enough with France to really promote what he said, but people in France are very empowered with the idea. What I feel, and we actually with the tribunal, we did a declaration asking the governments that we've done our chore. We have created this tribunal, but now this tribunal should not longer be an ethical tribunal that is a non-binding tribunal, but that it should be taken by the authorities as a real tribunal. And that is the same of what happened. We actually did this tribunal mocking what happened after Second World War, where civil society created a tribunal to judge war crimes. And then the countries of Europe decided to take this to a binding court. I think that it's a moment where countries need to get more empowered. I just feel, and I get frustrated very often with countries like Ecuador that have rights of nature, that don't have like a very strong international policy to, really promote that other countries follow the same path. And I feel that yes, civil society needs to move forward, and we're doing that, and more people are getting empowered. The government of Baviera is trying to change its constitution to recognize rights of nature in Germany. And we have all these amazing things happening, but they're not going to happen fast enough if citizens don't force their governments to take it to another scale. And for governments to, recognize the Declaration for the Rights of Mother Earth, or to recognize that nature has rights, or to create a binding tribunal to review these cases of big ecocides around the world, we need to take it to a different level. And that's why we also need to be pressuring governments. So I do feel that as civil society, we have a very strong case to make when bringing up small cases or cases in our own countries, but we really need to come together to force our governments to incorporate this and make it bigger, because it's the only way. When you bring nature into the conversation, as Cormac was saying, you think about it in a different perspective. Right now, I like this comparison when, if you can, if I fall, I can have a bruise or something, and that'll maybe heal in 2-3 weeks. But if someone cuts my arm, that arm won't grow back again. And it's the same thing we're doing with nature. It's absurd to think that we cannot harm nature, because we pollute it, we harm it, we have an impact as human beings, and that's not going to stop. And the rights of nature movement is not telling you to live an untouchable nature. It's not telling you do not touch nature and be in your corner, like when we were with COVID, all inside our houses. We're not saying that. We're just saying that we need to have a better relationship with nature, so that when we use nature, because we need wood, we need water, etc., we don't cut nature's arms. We don't create these big ecocides where we're not allowing nature to regenerate. We're just we're doing it in a responsible way, in a respectful way with nature. So this is the way to go back to this balance. And it's pretty important to understand this, because some people think about the rights of nature and they say, oh, these conservative people, they just want to create more national parks, and take us all away from that. And that's not true. What we want is to restore the relationship with nature. And I feel that the tribunals have done that, but the next very important step is for governments to also be pioneering, with this idea and bringing more countries on board. And I was, as I was saying, very happy to see that many countries are very open to the idea of the rights of nature. But I feel that we need some important countries to be leading this, and of course civil society pushing this change.
Natty, what you mentioned, you used the word ecocide a couple of times. There's an international movement around ecocide. How does that relate? Could you explain how that relates to the rights of nature work?
Sure.
How it's different, how it's the same?
We work very closely with the Ecocide campaign and with the ecocide movement, and I feel that in continents like Europe, for example, ecocide is a much easier way, I'll say, to get to the rights of nature. I feel it's like a step. People will be more keen or more open to receive or to accept the idea that we need to judge these huge crimes, these ecocides. So these crimes where we're not allowing nature to regenerate, and those crimes need to be judged. I think that people, when they understand that we're doing these crimes to nature, it's important enough. So we really recognize that as a crime, it's important enough. But the next step will be the rights of nature, So yes, we recognize those crimes, but then we have to go to recognize that nature is a rights-bearing entity. And in continents like Europe, I feel is a really great way to get towards the rights of nature. I do feel, though, that it's not enough. As Cormac was saying, if the CEO of Chevron goes to jail, maybe we can celebrate because of the disaster that happened in Ecuador with the Chevron case, but that's not going to heal the Amazon that is still polluted with all that toxic waste of oil that was left for so many years in the Amazon. So we're not letting nature regenerate. We're not helping nature. So that's what I feel, that it's an important step. And companies and transnational organizations need to understand that they're under the eye and that they can be punished if they commit these ecocides. But in addition to that, we don't only want to take a person to jail because we don't get anything out of that. We want to restore nature. That's the most important part. And we want to avoid other companies, going back and doing these ecocides. I feel the idea of an ecocide is really interesting because it's very easy to understand. I think that we are all against ecocides. We don't want ecocides. And when we think about open mining in Ecuador or oil exploitation in the Amazon, and a big oil spill and all those dams that are just they break and they just destroy a whole village, those are of course indicators of an ecocide, and people can understand that, and we want to avoid that. So I think that understanding that idea and incorporating that concept and that as a crime is quite important. But I definitely feel that we need to go a step further and recognize that to avoid that, nature needs to be considered a subject of rights.
Right. Cormac, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a couple of things. One of the things that's been quite interesting for me is seeing the sort of different constituencies, if I can put it like that, emerging here, because rights of nature is not a left-wing or a right-wing thing. It's not about, I don't think it's something which you can put on that spectrum. There are many people who might classify themselves as left or right, who would support rights of nature. And I think that's because we're all earthlings. I mean, we're all creatures of the earth, and we share that in common. But also what's been interesting is to see the faith-based organizations come in quite strongly and increasingly so behind this idea. I mean, the Pope came out with an encyclical Laudato Si, but also the World Council of Churches. Many faith-based organizations are coming around to this area. In the Philippines, for example, the rights of nature is very strongly driven by church organizations. And I think it's because if you go into all of the faith traditions, they all have within them this understanding of the importance of creation, for want of a better word, and that it's not human. Although religion has also been used, of course, to justify harm to nature, I think that's changing, and those are important organizations as far as shifting norms and values in society are concerned. Then there's, of course, the youth. Young people can see that the system's not working, and they want systemic change. They don't want tweaking, and they're right. Tweaking is no longer going to work. And then, of course, we have Mother Nature herself. Creating. There are going to be more hurricanes and floods and fires, etc. And those are going to create pressure to people and make people more open to more fundamental change. So I think that there's a kind of a important groundswell. There's strong forces that are likely to feed into this movement all over the world. And I also like the fact that it's very consistent with science and indigenous wisdom. And I should say, we haven't talked much about it, but indigenous people are absolutely fundamental to this movement, and through our Indigenous Council play a very, very strong part in the movement everywhere, because these are the cultures who haven't lost that perspective of us being part of the whole, and they know how to read nature and to be attentive to the rules of the community of life. they know how to listen to the Mother Earth as a primary lawgiver. And we have so much to learn from them. And I'm not meaning this in any sort of romantic way. I mean, it's just obvious that if there are cultures that are much better at something than your culture, you'd be a fool not to try and learn from them. And so we really benefit hugely from the indigenous wisdom from the members of the alliance, and so that's also just to mention that as a very important part of this movement.
Yeah, thank you, Cormac. So let's see. I think we're going to leave time for some questions, but I'd like to hear just from both of you. What would you tell everybody on this call that they ought to do to move this? What can they do to move this idea forward, to make this an idea whose time truly has come?
Bill, maybe I can start by saying just get involved. I feel that that acupuncture that I was mentioning can be done, and it's better if it's done in more points around the world. So get involved, learn about the rights of nature. I bet that everybody who's listening to us today has a river close by that is threatened or polluted, or a forest or something. Get involved. Do not think and see this crisis from an observer's perspective. Get involved with your government, with your local authorities, with your local movements, with organizations that are doing this work. Hopefully you guys can become members of GAR and work with us. Really, now that I was mentioning, we have all these hubs. If you're a young person, get involved with the youth hub or with the academic sector. It's a time to get involved and not be like a passive activist. I will say, it's worth really going to the streets, getting organized with your neighborhood, and make the change as from the perspective and from the standpoint where you are.
Thank you, Cormac.
Yeah, just to add to that, I mean, I think I agree very much with what Nati's saying, but also I think what's really important is that to link up with other people, to join things, because what we're talking about, I believe that it's people that make change in the world. It's people that make change in the world, and the way I see it is that when you link up, it's like creating arteries. If you join other people and you make connections, they make kind of pipelines, and change can flow down those pipelines. So by linking up everybody in the world into this network of organizations, we are literally creating the kind of structure through which change can flow. And the other image, at the risk of mixing my metaphors, the other image that I'd like to leave you with is, if you go even to a city full of concrete, if you find a crack somewhere, there'll be probably a little plant trying to grow in that crack. And if it's not stomped on, it will eventually grow and it will widen the crack, and it will, if you left a city long enough, it would end up being a forest. Now, when we look at the world right now, it can be very depressing because you can see destruction everywhere. But unfortunately, the old has to die for the new to come. So I don't get too depressed about some of the destruction I see, but we have to be very careful we don't end up with something worse. And that's, as Nati said, is one of the real reasons for getting involved, because if you want to feel inspired and invigorated and enjoy life, you need to be one of those green shoots growing, and you need to be part of those networks through which life flows. Because if you just look at the crumbling concrete and lament its passing, it's a terribly depressing way to live. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Cormac, and thank you, Natty. Jim, I don't know if you're there or not, or if there are. I know you've been watching the chats, and there may be questions that people's comments that inspired questions from you, and so I'm going to leave some time to look at that. And I see Lynne has shown up. I'm not sure if she has.
It was like a meteor streaking across the sky. She was there for a brief moment. There she is.
I thought I was going to be a silent listener, but then I'm on the screen. I didn't mean it. I'm here.
So Lynn, is there anything you want to say as a silent listener?
Well, I just joined because I just got off another call, so I haven't heard anything except what Cormac just said. Hi, Cormac. But and hi, Natty. And I just love that this that you're making this platform available for this wonderful conversation about how important really addressing the kind of legal structures we've been caught in all along are beginning to be malleable, thank God, finally, so that we have some room to create the new world. So, but I haven't been in the conversation, so I don't have a comment other than yay.
Thank you and welcome you, Lynn, as always. And I think the area that I would like to initially explore, Natalie and Cormac and Bill, is the relationship that's been striking me as I've been listening to you between the emergence of the indigenous people and the emergence of the notion of the rights of nature. I mean, if you think about it, it feels to me that the two are very intertwined. For centuries and centuries, the indigenous were repressed, forgotten, and essentially taken to the brink of extinction. And over the last, I would say 50 years, there's been this emergence, both through the Pachamama Alliance, but many organizations around the world, as the indigenous people, in some ways came out of the forest, as it were, with warnings. I mean, if you think of the Kogi people in Colombia, there was a proactive movement on the part of many indigenous peoples almost simultaneously around the world to warn us of our impending doom if we didn't return to Pachamama. And as we began to nurture that openness in the modern consciousness, I think, was informed and led to the notion of the rights of nature. So I'd love to have you comment on the relationship between the indigenous peoples and indigenous wisdom and indigenous mind, and now moving forward into the rights of nature.
Maybe I can jump in and ask him for that. I think it's an incredibly important point, Jim. And if you speak to indigenous people, they don't often speak about rights, maybe never in their own languages. And I know many indigenous people, many indigenous languages don't even have a word for rights. But the reason is if you brought up in a culture where you recognize that you live in an animate world, and that other beings are your relations, you don't need that concept. It's already embedded in your culture in other ways. What indigenous people stress, of course, is duties, the duties that one has to him. So but what I've come across is, and I mean, I can't speak for indigenous people, but people that I have spoken to, they would say, even if we don't have this word rights of nature or this term in our language, it's a way of translating the indigenous world vision or cosmovision into a language that the Westerners can understand, because we structure our world very much on law. And if this is a way of translating, if you like, an indigenous worldview into a language which Westerners can engage with. And the first step is to say that nature has rights, because that forces you to confront the idea that nature is animate and subjective, it's not an object. And then you get to the next step, what are the duties of humans to respect those rights?
Yeah, well put. Thank you.
And maybe just to complement that, Jim, taking my experience with the Constitution, when we were drafting the Constitution, I remember we spoke with some indigenous people when we were with, and we said, look, this is one of the ideas that we're bringing forward, the idea of the rights of nature. And he said, you guys don't have that already? And it was so obvious, and I think that the idea of the rights of nature is so obvious, it's so rational. Nature should have rights. And of course, these instruments, constitutions that have been like a really like a wide instrument, the white tool, that has been really much monopolized by the modern world, and not by indigenous people. It's really like it has been completely disconnected from the indigenous rationality. And in Ecuador, including the rights of nature was a way to make this constitution a more democratic instrument and give that voice. And we see, like science telling us what indigenous people have been telling us all along, that nature is alive, that nature communicates, nature is our mother, that nature provides. I read that book, Bill, that you suggested of Finding the Mother Tree of Susan Simard, and she's telling you that, like all of those connections, how trees, connect and give to their siblings. It's such an amazing concept that it's amazing that we have to wait for science to tell us what indigenous people have been telling us, for us to wake up. But it's true, when we were here in Ecuador and we would try to talk to indigenous people about the rights of nature and this new tool that we have in the Constitution, we ran across many indigenous people who don't have the concept of rights and who couldn't understand that. But of course it made sense, and they said, of course, thank God you guys already did that, you should have done that a long time ago. So, and that's the way how we have incorporated that here. And indigenous people fear that this could be used as a tool from like NGOs or even corporations to bring forward the rights of nature. And unfortunately, in Ecuador, all the cases of rights of nature that we have been very respectfully worked with in the local communities, either indigenous or local communities, and it's been like an empowerment and a sum of collective rights and human rights with the rights of nature to bring forward a case to protect the forest or nature, and therefore protect nature's defenders.
Yeah, thank you for that. And just as a little add-on, Natalie, that Looking for the Mother Tree was such a powerful book. And a couple of weeks ago, I read about a British scientist who's now researching at a very granular level how exactly the mother trees and the mycelium and so forth communicate. And what he's putting forward is that they have discrete languages. It's not just some mental telepathy between the trees in some kind of amorphous way. It's actually a language. And he's now discerning that the language of the mushrooms and the language of we humans is structurally essentially the same. So that the next level of research is actually to figure out what the little mushrooms are saying to the trees. But it blew my mind, because we tend to think that human language is what differentiates us from nature. And what we're discovering is we're just following nature that has been doing it in a different way for an exceedingly long time. So I think that you're so right that the more science discovers, the more we realize that the indigenous awareness was absolutely correct. And that leads me to a remark that you made, Cormac, which I think is really seminal for us to take up as progressives. And that is this notion of alliances. Because if you think about it, the Achilles heel of, Paul Hawkins' Blessed Unrest is that there are millions of organizations out there doing every conceivable issue that needs attention. And yet we're weak because we don't collaborate in a way that brings strength to our numbers. And as the world teeters on the brink of the abyss, this issue of how we collaborate more effectively is, I think, of a crucial strategic importance. So I'd like to take the remaining moments of our time today, as we contemplate something like the rights of nature, to think through the strategy of alliance. So I'd love to maybe start with you to deepen this dialogue, because if you could just imagine all the NGOs and all the progressives all united, we would have solved these problems. It's the fact that we're not able to do that, that in a fundamental way constitutes the major part of our predicament. So this is an issue we've talked about before on Humanity Rising, but I was intrigued by your comments on the distinction between getting everyone into an NGO and as opposed to bringing people into an alignment of common goals. So speak more about that, and then Natalie, Lynn, Bill, would love to hear what you have to say.
Thanks, Jim. My thinking in that regard is very much shaped by my experience in the anti-apartheid movement, the struggle for democracy in South Africa. So, originally there was the African National Congress was formed with traditional hierarchical organization. The state came in and just imprisoned Mandela and all of the leaders, chopped their head off and basically stopped it for about 10 years. And then what happened, there was a mass democratic movement arose within the country. And you could be a trades union, you could be a sports club, you could be all kinds of organizations, so you could join these alliance. And you only had to agree on, I think it was 4 things initially: that you were non-racial, you believed in democracy, and you ran your organization in a democratic way. You were against a new constitution that had been proposed at that time, and maybe it was just those 3 things. So the idea is, if you want the more rules you lay down for membership, the more people you exclude. So if you want to build a big movement, you've got to accept that you are not going to agree with everybody. So you try and find the minimum number of principles that you have to share in order to be able to work together. And I think in the Global Alliance, I think we've got 4. But that thinking was very conscious from the beginning, that you say we don't have to agree on everything, but these are the things which are fundamental to us. And what I think is special about this movement is that the common, as somebody once said to me, when we're arguing, we sometimes forget that the common ground that we seek is beneath our feet. And what we all have in common is earth. We are all earthlings. And so this is an alliance which is built on that fundamental platform, which is as inclusive pretty much as you can be. And so it's a great platform for building alliances. But it does require that discipline of working with people that you don't agree with on many issues, because the few things that you have in common are enough.
Yeah, beautifully put. Natalie, anything you want to add?
I would just I always love when I hear that from Cormac, because unfortunately we as environmentalists, and it happens a lot here in Ecuador, we get divided by the smallest things, and we cannot work together because we don't agree with very certain specific things, and we can recognize how strong we will be if we come together. So I feel that that's the most important part, and hopefully the most important part of this message of how do we work together? How do we really create alliances that look for the welfare of humanity and all the living community, including nature? And I think that that's what we need to look forward. And unfortunately, it's hard, but that's where we are aiming at.
Yeah. Bill, Lynn, any comment?
Lynn, go ahead.
Well, I'm very grateful to hear that you all are aware of Suzanne Simard's amazing work, and I've been so grateful to know her and work with her, and she really changed my whole world. And I'm rather than make a brilliant comment, I'm just going to say that I'm sitting on a 3rd floor of our house in San Francisco, and they're taking down 100 trees in the Presidio right next to where we live. And since I read her book, Mother Tree, Finding the Mother Tree, and have been working with Suzanne, and since the Rights of Nature conversation, has become such a seminal part of our lives, I really see that these are beings that are being cut down, and that they've been here for hundreds of years, and they've been in conversation their societies, that each tree has thousands of species, that the mycorrhizal network underneath them is traumatized by this huge event of cutting down these trees. And I don't know if you can hear the machines. And then the machines that are cutting them down are so violent in their, they're like that movie Avatar, where the little guy is inside this big giant thing and he's suddenly becomes a big monster of a machine. And that is the way we've related to nature. So I just wanted to say that because it's happening right now. I'm looking at these trees going down. It's just like, and it's heartbreaking, and I can feel them. I never was that way before we started talking like this. And now I feel connected to them. They're beings. They are, they have wisdom, and that wisdom is now being passed on right now before they cut them down through the mycorrhizal network to other trees. And in Suzanne's book and with Suzanne's research, and I'm sure what you all have talked about, you can feel that it's actually happening. But then I'll say something about alliances, because one of the great teachings of the Pachamama Alliance is this, that at the source of all of our misunderstandings is this notion of separateness, that we are separate selves, that we're separate from each other, that we're separate from nature, that we're separate from previous generations, that separate selves mythology is at the heart of almost every problem that we're facing. And so to move from project and initiative and driving for your particular outcome to an alliance is one of the hardest things for us to do, and probably one of the most important things for us to do. And then I just want to make a distinction between agreement, being in agreement with each other, which is very difficult and not even necessary, and finding where we're aligned. Alignment, which is deeper. It goes to the root of who we are as a human family, who we are as a community of life. And to disagree is helpful and almost holy. That's how we become creative and think of new thoughts. But always to really go deeper to the taproot of alignment, which is a distinction that has a completely different nature than agreement, and allows disagreements to be creative, allows conflict, as they say in Search for Common Ground, our good friends John Marks and Susan Collin Marks. Conflict is healthy. It's how we respond to it that's unhealthy, and that conflict can be completely transformational because it generates a cauldron of immense creativity if you're willing to tap into the deepest alignment. So those are some thoughts.
Beautifully put, Lynn. Thank you. Words are important. You know, there's a distinction between a coalition and an alliance, and between common agreement and alignment. And I think you're making a very important distinction that's worth contemplating. Yes. Bill, anything you'd like to add?
Just two things. One is, I think of in our, where we call ourselves the Pachamama Alliance, one of our principles is that it's amazing what you can produce when people are working together. It's amazing what you can produce when people aren't worried about who's getting credit. So that was one of a principle of alliances that we've used, and I think it served us well. Another thing I wanted to say about alliances, and it's kind of what Natty was pointing at, how the example, and I know Natty was the head of an organization in Ecuador that has like 60 or more environmental organizations all trying to work together. And so I think she was referencing how hard that was, even though they ought to have a common vision where they're going. People get caught up in the way they want to do it, or their own commitments, sub-commitments that they've made. I think Rights of Nature provides a way for organizations that are working on restoring life on this planet ensuring the regeneration, restoration of life on this planet, that Rights of Nature provides a way for organizations to have a common vision that is down the road far enough that the path they're taking can all be aligned on, that there's no competition. There's many ways to get to where we're trying to go. And I think Rights of Nature is a way for organizations that are working on environmental issues, social justice issues, spiritual empowerment issues for life on this planet, to actually have a vision that can unite people. And I'm struck by by a quote I heard recently that's really affected me and empowered me, inspired me. And it was actually it's this thing, the way Kurt Vonnegut used this phrase, "for heaven's sake." So normally we think of the phrase "for heaven's sake," you think, for heaven's sake, don't you understand how to do that? Or for heaven's sake, why are you doing that? And he turned it around in a story he was telling about, let's see, he made this statement about how practicing an art, no matter how well or how badly, is a way to make our soul grow, a way to make your soul grow. And then he adds, "for heaven's sake." And it for me, that just reunites. Like, all of us have a different way we're going and the different things we're committed to. But we're doing it, if we're all see that we're doing it for heaven's sake, there's something that pulls that all together and allows us all to be aligned on something. And Rights of Nature for me is in that domain of heaven, for heaven's sake. We're doing it for heaven's sake. We're doing it because we know we're in a system of deep reverence and connection with all life. And Rights of Nature then is a natural way to get into alliances, to build alliances. And the Global Alliance for Rights of Nature is a really effective organization at doing that.
Thank you, Bill. Beautifully put. That's a beautiful, I think, final statement for our session, that it's about aligning with the Mother. It's about aligning with the heavens. And as we know from our study of the Tao, that when heaven and earth are united, all life is balanced and people live in harmony with the whole. So I think that's a beautiful image with which to conclude our session today on the rights of nature, which emanated out of the growing recognition of the rights of indigenous peoples. And out of that, I think this whole notion of alignment that you're bringing in, Lynne, is so important, because I think that the spirit of the indigenous peoples has a different logic than the cold rationality and coalition building of the Western mind. So there's a whole very subtle but extraordinarily nuanced and powerful spirit that all of you have, embodied today as we contemplate these very, very deep issues. So Natalie, Cormac, Lynne, and Bill, thank you so much. This has been a beautiful second session convened by you folks at the Pachamama Alliance. And I think it's you, Lynne, that is going to be there tomorrow. Maybe you could say something about tomorrow's program.
Well, tomorrow we'll be talking about the Amazon Sacred Headwaters initiative, which has now been changed in the last few days to the Amazon Sacred Headwaters Alliance. They changed the name in the last couple of days for the exact reason that we're having this conversation, so that these nearly 30 indigenous nations who are working together to preserve the sacred headwaters of the Amazon can work together in an alliance. So there'll be two indigenous leaders who don't speak English, so it's going to be kind of interesting to do the translation here. But Anatoso Soltani, who's the global strategist for the Amazon Sacred Headwaters Alliance, and me. And we'll look forward to our conversation with each other and with you, Jim. It's always so great to to talk to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Bill, Natalie, Cormac. This has been a beautiful session. I urge all of you to go on to the Pachamama Alliance website, pachamamaalliance.org. There's a lot of material that you can all learn from. We'll be hearing more about the Sacred Headwaters Alliance tomorrow, and that'll be our third of 5 days with the Pachamama Alliance as we begin our fall programming here on Humanity Rising. And I would just end with the following note, because I think this conversation has been unusually important. And that is around how we progressives, shall we call us in the largest sense of that term, how do we at this moment come together with sufficient clarity and depth that we can make the difference we need to make in a world, as we've all noted, that is really tipping at the precipice in ways that would allow them to be cutting down 100 sacred trees right outside of Lynne's window. That's what we're up against. And they're doing it in the Amazon. And they're doing it all over the world with increasing ferociousness and increasing abandon. So we've asked this question before on Humanity Rising, and I wanted to just note it again, that there's deep issues that we still have yet to grapple with of how we empower ourselves in a way that can make the difference we so desperately seek. So I just want to leave you with this notion of alliance and alignment and how we bring Pachamama and heaven together in a more powerful way, such that we humans that are in the pivot between all of it can so align ourselves that we generate the change in consciousness that is required. So I just wanted to leave everybody with that question today, and we'll dive in deeper to the Amazonian complexio tomorrow when we meet. Thank you, everyone. That'll do it for us for today. This has been a wonderful session. We'll see you again tomorrow. You're welcome to the after session chat group. You'll see the link that Stan has put into the chat box. Bye for now. Wonderful session, folks. Wonderful, wonderful session.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Jay.